So now you're in Minister of the Tower, you're gonna sit near each other.
It's okay. I can deal with it. That actually, yeah, basically for the same amount of time, they're also in person. Basically, the monkeys are way better than us. Yeah. So we have to somewhere else.
Okay, so I think we can get started again. So next we have Ted Adelson, and going to tell us how to go out of business. So let's hear what he has to say.
Hi. It's great to be talking to a crowd that's dominated by vision people. These days, I mostly hang out with roboticists, but I'm curious to get the reaction from vision people.
The volume is kind of low. Maybe move the microphone closer.
Is this better?
No.
No?
Let me ask it.
Should I just talk loud? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to talk loud.
That sounds better.
Okay. At any rate, I'm interested in your thoughts. Okay, how do you tell a fork from a spoon? Well, you know, fork's got these straight things we call tines, and it's got this bigger thing called a handle, and they're attached, and a spoon's got a round thing called a bowl, and it's got a handle, and they're attached. And how do you tell near things from far things? Well, we all, teach our students about the pictorial cues, like height in visual field on the left, or occlusion or interposition on the right. And it's a familiar and compelling way to talk about how vision works. The idea is we'll find these features or cues and figure out how to combine them. And so it makes sense. Images contain lots of cues. Cues are easily and locally computed. That's the idea. And vision involves finding and combining them. And by understanding the cues and the combination rules, we can understand human vision, and then we can do human-inspired computer vision, or at least that's what some of us used to think, and I don't think people really think that's true anymore. But it's still very tempting to try to find cues, and maybe it's still a good idea. That's what I'm wondering about. And here's something that I used to work on, the problem of material perception. As opposed to telling the difference between a fork and a spoon, which seems pretty easy, how do you tell the difference between a clear plastic fork and a metal fork? And if you look at it, it's easy enough to tell by looking. But if I ask you to figure out how to make a machine do that, it's much more puzzling. And in fact, when I worked on this, we made, I would say, baby steps in that direction, but never really got that far. And as far as I know, no one's gotten much farther. And so this still remains an intractable problem. So, like everybody else, let's ask VLM, let's ask GPT-4o. So I asked, which one is a clear plastic fork and which one is a metal fork, and how can you tell? It says the top picture is the clear plastic fork. It has the lightweight, transparent appearance typical of plastic. The bottom picture is the metal fork. It has the reflective appearance typical of metal. So that's terrific because it solved this problem that I don't know how to solve and nobody else knows how to solve. And also it gave a useless explanation, which basically is, I know the plastic fork is plastic because it looks like plastic. I know the metal fork is metal because it looks like metal. Okay, let's keep going with cues. Is this man smiling or frowning? Well, we know the biggest cue to smiling is the way the mouth is curved. And so if GPT-4o is using that curve, it'll tell us that this man's frowning. Anyone want to guess? I guess I wouldn't be showing you this unless I knew.
I think he's smiling, so I'm going to say that that's what the model is. It's in the eye. Yeah, exactly. It's the eye.
All right, GPT-4o says, the man appears to be smiling. His mouth has an upward curve, typical of a smile. So on the one hand, it works. It does this amazing thing, which is to tell that this man is actually smiling. On the other hand, its explanation is nonsensical and bogus.
Is it possible, though, that it's first deciding based on the picture that it's smiling, and once it did that, it already forgot about the picture, and it continues with talking about smiling based on language next to a contradiction?
Yeah, I guess people say, it's doing its best to imitate what a person would say, and a person would say something like that. Except a person, of course, would bother to look back at the picture. His mouth is not curving. Anyway, so successes and frustrations there. Anyway, so GPT-4o can solve problems that vision researchers have no idea how to solve, and it can't explain how it solves them. It just solves them by looking, and that's frustrating. So one thing we've learned from machine learning is images are extremely high dimensional. You can't make sense of them by listing a handful of features and cues. You need an extraordinarily high dimensional representation and computation that no one can understand. So, but we still have this feeling like we need to make progress by finding things that we understand.
Ted,
Yeah.
if the model would say something like, I know this is a plastic fork because here is another plastic fork that I know is plastic and this is close to it. Is that going to be, are you going to be happy with that explanation? Basically a nearest neighbor explanation.
Well, I guess that might be true because, of course, there's a lot of pictures of plastic forks online. But I am presuming, which I didn't actually test here, that it can generalize beyond just plastic forks. But I should test that. Okay, well, anyway, I got distracted from vision when my wife and I had children. And I just recommend everybody who hasn't had children have children because they're just, it's just so amazing to watch what they do. And what Robin is doing here. So she's so young, she can't even sit up in a chair without the special chair to help her sit up. But she just does amazing explorations with her fingers. She's discovering the world. When she gets bored of her toy, she starts exploring her chair. And so I thought it would be fascinating to watch her vision develop, but I found I was much more interested in what she was doing with her fingers. And I asked my robotics friends, hey, what do you understand about how you can use hands and touch to make sense of the world? And they said, well, we really don't understand anything about that because, first of all, we don't have any good touch sensors. You would need a touch sensor that was soft and sensitive like a human finger, and nobody has anything like that. So I came up with something which we call GelSight, It's a compliant tactile sensor that converts pressure patterns into images. The basic idea is you take a chunk of clear elastomer, meaning rubber, paint an elastomeric skin on it, which has reflective properties. And then, as you can see, if you press an Oreo into it and look from underneath, you'll see this shaded image. And you can use computer vision. We use usually photometric stereo, but anyway, you can use computer vision to infer the shape, and from that, the pressure pattern, and so on. So it's a really simple idea, and it works real well. And here's just for fun, an Oreo rolling around on a pad of gelsite. And here's a robot finger we call the wedge. And when you press a screw against it, in the middle you can see the red stuff is the raw video image. I'm sorry, the colored stuff is the raw video image. The arrows are showing the shear, and on the right is a 3D reconstruction of the surface. So you can get this wonderful sensory data out of these things. And now, for the first time, you're in a position to ask, okay, what's happening when a human or a robot finger interacts with the world? Because previously you really couldn't get good information about the mechanical signal present at the finger. And we can return to material perception by asking, for example, how do you tell hard versus soft? And let's take the case of picking out a ripe tomato. Suppose you send your robot to the store to get a ripe tomato. What's the robot going to do? If it's like you, it'll pick up the tomato and it'll squeeze it to see whether it's hard or soft. Now, how do you tell hard or soft by squeezing? You probably think intuitively that as you squeeze, you see, well, how much does my finger, how does the distance between the fingers change as I squeeze? But the main cue to hardness and softness actually is not that. It's actually the way the skin is deforming, not the separation between the fingers. And you can demonstrate this to yourself by, if you put your finger down on the table, close your eyes, have a friend touch your finger with a tomato, and so your finger is passive and you can't see what's going on. And you'll immediately say, oh, that's hard or that's soft, and you can tell. And if I ask you, how can you tell it's hard or soft, you'll say, it feels hard or soft. So you have no idea what's going on, but you can tell. Okay, so what is going on? This is what's going on. On the left is a video of pressing a soft tomato against the gelsite pad, and on the right is a hard tomato. And what happens, the hard tomato retains its shape. As you press, if it's spherical, it just stays spherical and just advances into the depth of the rubber. But the soft tomato flattens out. You've got this competition between two somewhat soft things. One is the tomato, one is your pad, and the one that's harder is going to impose its shape more on the other one. So you've got this competition between two soft things that allows you to tell which one is hard and which one is soft. So it looks like there should be some nice math you could do here to extract a real cue about hardness. And for a while, we tried doing that, but we're not very good at math, or at least speaking for myself, not very good at math. And anyway, math requires some assumptions, and who knows if the assumptions are right. So we just did machine learning. And that was actually not easy, because what Wenjin did is she built a library of harder and softer shapes out of silicone rubber. So there's 300 different shapes there, and they're different hardnesses. And we know the hardnesses because she made them. So we can keep track of the hardnesses. And then below you see pictures. These are still pictures of pressing what you get when you press against them. But it's important that you can't get the information about hardness from a single picture. It's the sequence and the way it changes as you press that tells you. So we're capturing these image sequences and doing some standard machine learning tricks. Of course, well, machine learning, it always works. And so it works. And here she's measuring avocados. This one gets a rating of 84.6. And this one gets a rating of 56.8. We don't know if those numbers are exactly right, but that's on the Shor double aught scale, by the way. What we know is that if a human orders a bunch of avocados in order of hardness and the machine orders them, they get the same ordering, which is really what you want. And so, as usual, whenever you do a machine learning experiment of this sort, the answer is always 87%, right? It always worked better than you feared and worse than you hoped. So that's what we got. All right, so what was the research methodology? In summary, 1, you set up pilot explorations. 2, you get insights about hardness cues, the way the thing flattens over time. And then 3, you throw away those insights and you just do machine learning. Okay, so now I'll tell you about another project where we took it a step further. Don't even bother trying to understand things, do machine learning. And everyone knows this has end-to-end machine learning. All right. And it works. Okay, so this is what we call a swing bot. If I give you a pen and I say, can you go like this and make it so it starts here and it swings up like this? And if you practice, you can do it. So you can get a robot to do that too. And if you just have one pen and you just hard code it by hand and you play with the parameters of the trajectory, you can get it to do that fine with some trial and error. But suppose you want to give it lots of different pens and have it be able to succeed with different pens. Well, if I give you a bunch of different pens, big and small, heavy and light, with a lot of friction or a little friction, you can kind of play with it and feel it and get a sense of how it's going to behave. And so you can do a swing up pretty well with all these different kinds of pens. So that's the question is, can we teach the robot to do that? So we are going to make pens that have different weights, different masses, different friction, different center of masses, and different distributions of the mass. So we've made these 3D printed so-called pens, these templates, that we could reconfigure different ways to get different friction, different mass, different center of mass, different moment of inertia, to see whether we get the robot to learn by feel how to act. And it's important to note that we didn't tell the robot any of these numbers, mass, center of mass, friction, et cetera. We couldn't because we didn't know them. But the question is, could it do something? If I give it to you and say, can you do this? You don't know them either. So the question is, can it learn to do this thing? So the first step is this getting the feel of the pen, this tactile exploration. In haptics, people call this exploratory procedures. We chose these 2 procedures, one of which is a static thing where you hold it at different angles, and the other is a dynamic thing where you shake it. And you extract this feature vector, and then you experimentally swing up and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, you change your parameters. You change your swing parameters. And gathered data. We've got our robot arm with the gel site gripper, our object, and this recycling system, which is basically a robot training a robot, so that the robot arm's on the left and this robot recycling system is on the right. And you can just do this for a lot of trials until you are in tears and the gel site wears out. Okay, here are the signals. These are the static signals from just these two, holding it two positions. You see there's different amounts of torque, so you see different amounts of shear. And then when you shake it, you'll see different amounts of wiggling. And you can also, there's some friction information as well as inertia information there. And then throw everything into the neural net. These are the static signals. That goes into one neural net, and the dynamic signals goes into another neural net. And they're combined. And then we've got the control parameters, the experimental controls, where the robot tries different parameters for its trajectory, try to predict the angle that you're going to end up with, and try to get that as correct as possible. And so, you know, it works. It always works. There we go. For different objects, these are unseen objects with different friction and different mass, center of mass, etc. And it can do it. And also, encouragingly, if you try to look inside the embedding, it's clustering things in a sensible way. And on the right shows how, if you ask it to do different, if you challenge it to do different angles with the same things, it learns how to adjust depending on the combination of angle and the physical parameters. It learns how to adjust its trajectory. And kind of makes sense in a way that tells you that, yes, it implicitly, but not explicitly, it implicitly learned the parameters of the object that it needs to learn. So I think this is pretty cool, and it's the opposite of what a mechanical engineer might have tried, which is to try to build a proper model of the physical problem. And so in that sense, it's more like what we as humans have to deal with, since we're not given those parameters. So I think it's a nice piece of progress. And so just to summarize that project, we have the tactile sensing, so we can do these exploratory procedures. We chose tilting and shaking to get data implicitly about these different properties. Well, it works. It implicitly learns those properties insofar as they are required to, it needs that knowledge in order to successfully do that task. All right, so this is a summary of the whole talk. So material perception by vision is hard to understand. VLMs can do it, we don't know how. With tactile sensing, we found a promising cue for hardness, which is the way the object geometry changes over time when you press. But we punted on really understanding that and just did machine learning. And I feel a little bad about that. Should we sharpen our understanding of that cue? And then in the last project, we just said, we just went all the way. Let's just do end-to-end machine learning, see how far we can get with that, and we can get quite far. And it's really cool, but is it good enough? Are we going to be able to do end-to-end learning and continue to make progress, or do we really need more understandable representations? So the questions, I'm genuinely curious about what people are feeling these days. To what extent should we just embrace machine learning, and to what extent should we cling to our old hopes about finding features and cues? Let me know what you think. Thanks.
Great. So we have plenty of time for questions, commentary.
All right.
So this is something I think about a lot too. I feel like the new style of vision, I call it vision by asking nicely. Because these machines, they know the answer, and you just have to ask them the right way, and they'll but I also desperately want to have an explanation, a story, a reason. And it seems like at odds, with good performance and no story, or a nice story but terrible performance. And the only thing that seems to bridge that gap is the Viola-Jones face detector, or these kind of incremental approximation methods, which are on one hand high capacity, on the other hand they do kind of a cartoon story at the beginning, and then they clean up the details later as you go on. I don't know. It's my hope that these modular explanations are going to win out in the end, but all evidence is against it.
So I know Alyosha once told me that the success of Viola-Jones was illusory, let's say. That it wasn't anything about the representation.
No, I believe it's data.
It was just the data.
Because, Khalid Kanadi and the Scheimer Kanadi were doing just as well with completely different methods.
Anyway, so did you want to make that point?
No, I want to, I want to cheer you guys up. I don't think it's so, I think it's just that the issue is that the explanation maybe is at a different level. So, for example, you try to get explanation of, biology. It's hard and messy and it's very hard. But the meta explanation, one given by Darwin, is clean, simple, and beautiful. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. So I think the explanation about material perception in this case, I don't believe it's really just nearest neighbor. It's not that it only works for plastic spoons. I think it's going to work for other plastic things as well. But it's because somehow it has seen so much different data that it learns about the texture, the texture of the plastic texture, and it's detecting that. But it's very hard to describe texture. My dear advisor Jitendra told me once that texture is to be seen, not heard. And so I think it's perfectly fine to have an explanation that has, look, there is a very complicated thing, this tactile texture or visual texture, and then on top of it there is an explanation of, well, I have seen the texture attached to the word plastic, and I have seen this other things as well, and because I've seen so many of these things, they all work together and it all works out. So I think we can all be happy, and you can have your cues, and I can have my data, and it's all fine.
Okay, except I'm not sure we're going to get the cues.
No, the cues are implicit.
Okay, you say, trust me.
3-word or a 3-parameter model like Torrance Sparrow is not going to happen. It's going to be a very high-dimensional model, but it's still going to be a model.
Yeah, but then that's not what he wants. He wants cues that he can verbally express in a few simple statements, not something that's only expressible via high-dimensional set of parameters.
Yeah, so I like your talk a lot. So I think that, I don't see your talk really as being this dichotomy between cues or not, because the fact that you chose to pick touch is a cue. You didn't consider it before, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's also a form of perhaps a human selecting the proper type of cue because you suspect it to be informative. Similarly for images, if we said the question was, how can you detect if something is hot from RGB? You'd say, well, you might not know, but if you look at infrared, that's also a cue that you might select, right? So I don't really see this as, I don't know, being depressing for cues, because the fact that you selected touch, or maybe in this other example, infrared, is a form of cue selection by itself.
Okay, so I think that there's more than one way to use the word cue. And I think you're using one of the ways, which is as a source of data or a source of information. And I think you're quite right about that. And it is true that I got fascinated by how you could use this source of information. And it's also true that it brings me to the one place where I feel hopeful that I can still make forward progress, which is in hardware, because so I'm building hardware. I think the trajectory of machine learning is as long as you've got the data, don't worry, it's all going to get solved. And if that's true, this is why I have the title "Putting Ourselves Out of Business." As the machine learning gets better and better, our job is only to supply data. And well, it's interesting. Nobody wants to build hardware like touch sensors. So, but I'm doing it, so I feel like I'm doing my job. I still have a job because I'm building hardware. But I'm not sure, are you guys all going to have jobs if you're just running machine learning algorithms?
So compared to other fields like physics or some forms of engineering, if you want to know the lift and the drag of a certain wing profile, you cannot compute it with Navier-Stokes equations, and they get pretty close. Now, the Navier-Stokes equations are very simple to express, but the way they act on that particular wing profile, you will never know. So once you go through the calculation, everything is a mystery. And then finally you get two numbers you wanted, which are lift and drag. Is that a form of knowledge you respect, or is it like machine learning?
All right, that's a good question. It looks like understanding, except it's just...
So is it understanding or not? Because I don't understand why I make a little wiggle in the wing, all of a sudden the whole thing changes, but I'm not able to tell how. And I'm solving exactly the same equation, and it gives me two different numbers. So is it understanding or not? What's your thinking?
I don't know, it's a good question.
I had a question about, so with these examples where you're kind of spinning the pen up, did you simulate that before you, I know you were saying you didn't even measure at the center of mass and things like that. Did you simulate it before you built the hardware?
No, we didn't do any simulation on either of those projects. And at the time that we did the hardness project, it would have been hard to do a good simulation, although now people have techniques for that. But no, we just went straight empirical on both of those. On the physics question, I think this is one of the problems. Both well, the advantages of the correct understanding of the physical things is that it generalizes. You give me a new wing, it'll work, even if you don't understand it. And with these end-to-end things, we have this problem that, okay, we know for this robot arm, for this kind of template, we know, and for this task, which is to go like this, we know what to do. But if you give me another arm, another task, what am I going to do? I don't have a good way to generalize. So ultimately, that's what physics offers us, is an example of where you can take any situation as long as you can put it into the physical framework correctly. The equations are going to work. When you have an end-to-end learning system like this, you don't know how to extend it to something completely new, or not completely new, but something different. Yes.
I was wondering if connecting this with the first talk we had today would help to solve your question that you asked at the beginning. So if you train a model to connect the information it had from the gel finger, and to answer the question of is this a ripe tomato, and it could give you the answer like yes, it looks like a ripe tomato, I think it would give me a 84 on the hardness scale or whatever. With that feels to me like a more satisfying explanation. Like you've given me something that binds together two modalities to say it looks soft, I think it feels soft. So
I see.
would that get you, would combining those two kind of modalities help?
Yeah, I think that's a really, that's an exciting and important thing to do. In the case of tomatoes, I don't know if that's the right place for it, because the reason you feel the tomato is because you can't tell by vision. But if you think about what what's my daughter doing when she's playing with her stuffed toy and with her chair, certainly a lot of that is the fact that she's looking and feeling at the same time and bringing that together. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. Yeah.
So I'm thinking about these Frank Kyle questions about explanation, where he asks people things like, do you understand how a zipper works? And people start out by saying, yes, I do. And then you say, okay, explain to me how a zipper works. And of course, it turns out nobody knows how a zipper works. But what they do know is, if I go this way, it gets tighter, and if I go this way, it gets looser. So I know something about the structure of the interventions that I'm making, even though I don't know anything about what the details are. And I'm wondering if this might be true in the sort of psychophysical case as well. So I know I end up with a bunch of representations about objects and movement. That's the content of my visual experience. And I can reconstruct that there's a bunch of actual things out in the world, and I can use that to act on the things in the world, which is really amazing. But maybe the relationship between the two is, in fact, even for us, this long machine learning story about, what your daughter is doing when she's touching and feeling and holding the things is doing machine learning essentially on those relationships. But I'm not sure that should. Frank always says, well, that means you don't understand how zippers work. And it seems to me like, no, it means you do understand how zippers work. You just don't understand them in this particular detailed way.
Yeah, so you can say that our robot understands how this thing works, even though it doesn't have any of those proper parameters. And for me,
I mean, sort of the cube vision is kind of like, oh, you're going to have something that looks like your visual experience all the way through, right? You're going to have a representation that looks like your visual experience, but it's going to be a little bit further down the process, and it's going to be transformed into something else. And I'm not sure you need to have that to be able to actually think that you are understanding what the process.
Yeah, I guess it's one of the ways that I'm still obviously very ambivalent about all this, but let's take the hardness softness thing, and I say, okay, what I could ask, okay, what's really being extracted when you're extracting the hardness or softness? And I could imagine what's really being extracted is some mathematical thing that I imagine someone could figure out. But what's really being extracted is whatever I learned, right? I mean, in fact, I know that things feel hard or soft because I felt these things that are hard or soft. And I know they're hard or soft because I did other things. I looked at them, I squeezed them, and I bounced them, and whatever. And so in that sense, I shouldn't try to find out the real mathematically correct answer of what's happening. In that sense, I should be satisfied that my brain has managed to figure out how to bring all those things together. Yeah.
To go back to open high dimension, like earlier on, you pointed out there are these challenges. Just the data is high-dimensional, the model parameters are high-dimensional, the model representation is high-dimensional. And is there any hope in a path where we try to slice these models thinner in a sense, to be more iterative, or more incremental, like the Rodolph and Viola Jones? If we had more outputs, more intermediates, is that some way we could try to grapple with this, or maybe explain or understand them? Because part of the problem with end-to-end seems to be just the huge gap between the input end is very far from the output end.
I know there are some people, including in this room, who have been looking at making sense out of possible intermediate representations, and you want to speak to that?
Well, can I comment on that? I think, and this relates to how I'd answer your question. So, like, yes, you should just embrace machine learning. But then if you're feeling dissatisfied with the lack of explanation, I think it is the right thing to do to then go and try to figure out what is the solution that your deep neural network has extracted. And there is a huge field of research in this area, and I think it's actually how science often progresses. I like this analogy with the steam engines. So apparently they invented steam engines way earlier than they got adopted in society. And the issue was that before they had a good understanding of pressure and temperature and thermodynamics, they would often blow up. So they weren't widely used, but they would sometimes work, and they didn't really know fully why and what was going wrong with it. But luckily they didn't abandon it. They weren't like, well, we're only going to make engines that we can fully explain. Instead, they kept pushing ahead with the thing they didn't understand, and eventually they developed the theory of how it worked. And I think that's how science often progresses, and I think that's exactly what we got to do here. You've got this thing that works. It's maybe not as satisfying as something that you can easily explain why it works, but it's better to stick with that thing that works and try to figure out why it works, and then eventually that'll also give you the tools to make it safer and generalize better.
That's encouraging. I like that. Dan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wonder, so let's say you were to have a theory of this in a more satisfying way. What would you do with that? I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean, like, what type of design problem do you think it would help you solve that currently you're having trouble with the gel sites or with this research going? Like, how would you leverage that theory?
That's a good question. I don't know. I just intuitively feel like I really want to understand how everything works. And if I do, it gives me the tools I'll need to move further. But I can't give you an exact case for that.
Wouldn't it let you generalize to a new pen?
Well, maybe. But I think the real question is, can we generalize to a wider range of tasks, a wider range of robotic instruments, and so on. And I'm sorry, it's a good question. I don't have a good answer.
But your sort of intuition is that somehow it might help you do something like that, generalize to new tasks, new objects or something. Or...
Yeah. New experiments, new hardware, all of these things. I think this is building hardware. That's one of the things where I feel like an understanding is important. Is well, if my hardware isn't able to extract the data that I need for the task, then I need to change the hardware. But in order to do that, I have to understand what it is that I need for the task.
Do you feel like your current hardware isn't extracting enough somehow, and you could be better at that if you understood what it needed to extract somehow more?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, that's cool.
Okay, so I think we should end there. So let's thank Ted again. Okay. Oh, sure. Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. So we have a special